Okay, great. Well, I think we've got lots of people online and we'll have a few more people coming in, I'm sure, later on. So we'll just get things started. So welcome again to our New Directions webinar. I am Richard Spivey. I'm a researcher at the British Council and the New Directions Conference Chair. Welcome to this webinar today, and thank you for joining us today and making time for us. We hope it's going to be interesting experience for you. So this is part of our New Directions conference. And if you're not familiar with New Directions, here are a few details about it. It's the British Council's flagship conference about language testing and assessment. And we hope that the conference will give a view of language assessment at local, regional and international levels. So we have speakers from around the world and from the East Asia region who will be giving talks at the conference. It was established in 2013. I think this is now our 12th conference. We were in Hanoi in Vietnam last year, and we are very proud to be in Bangkok, Thailand this year. I'll give you the links to the website later on after the talk today, so you can see for yourself and you can register as well. So the conference is quite soon, in a couple of weeks, 21st to the 23rd of November. And it will be at Chulalongkorn University. It's a face-to-face conference. We don't have an online presence to the conference this year. So it's only face-to-face. And our theme is the power of language assessment on individuals and society. So these are some of the things that people will be talking about, some of the themes to our conference. So language policy, learning and assessment, language policy and society, multilingualism and English alongside other languages is another theme to our conference, looking at all the languages in East Asia alongside English. And also, very popular topic is technology and AI, and thinking about the impact of AI on learning and assessment. So this is the third of our webinars before the conference, our final webinar. We hope to see some of you at the conference this month. So it'll last about 40 minutes, maybe a bit more, a bit less, but please, if you have questions, and I hope you will, write them into the Q&A or into the chat, and I will ask the questions, or as many questions as we can get through at the end. And then I'll give you some links to register for the conference and to get more information about the conference if you wish. So today I would just like to introduce our speaker. So today we have the pleasure of hosting Pariwat Imsad, who is an assistant professor at the Faculty of Liberal Arts in Thammasat University. He is also a member of Thailand's TESOL's Executive Committee. He has degrees from Thailand and the UK. He spent a lot of time doing training, pre-service and in-service training and professional development workshops in Thailand and other countries. And his research interests encompass language testing and assessment, English language teaching methodologies, teacher education, and reflective practice. So his talk today is called Language Assessments in Action, Transforming Practices to Make a Difference in Teaching and Learning. So thank you very much for joining us today, Pariwat. I am going to stop sharing my screen and hand over to you.
Thank you so much, Richard. Thank you for having me. So Let me share my screen first, so make sure that
Okay.
this is coming up, right?
Yep, that's right.
Wonderful. So, good afternoon from Bangkok, Thailand, and good morning, good evening to people from every corner around the world. I can see that there are many people from different places joining our webinar today. So, once again, thank you for having me. And as you can see on the screen here, this is my title, right? Which is language assessment in action. We have the keyword, which is in action and transforming practices to make a difference in teaching and learning, right? If you can guess from the title itself, usually many people usually consider assessment as the final stage of, learning process, right? But again, we can think again and again that language assessment can be, at any stage of teaching and learning. We'll talk about that. Anyway, so before we start, can I have a question for everyone here? The question is very simple, just simply yes and no answer, right? Can we live without a test? So just feel free to drop your thoughts, in the chat box or wherever you feel comfortable. So just want to make sure that I can see some. I can see some responses in the chat box. No, no way. I don't think. Unfortunately, not. No. Okay. Wonderful. Oh, so the responses are very consistent, right? Very reliable, right? No, and it come in different forms. Okay. No. Interesting. Just wondering if there's somebody there's somebody who think differently, right? Tests need to be defined. Interesting. Right. So okay, the responses are pretty consistent. Oh, I have another response here. Yes, we can. Okay. Okay. Interesting. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about that soon, right? But usually, this question can be pretty tricky because I said, can we live without a test, right? But if you, I'm pretty sure that you might have heard some terms in the field of language testing and assessment, right? Which is test or testing, right? And assessment. But again, when we talk about assessment, assessment is viewed broadly as the process of collecting, synthesizing, and interpreting information in order to aid in decision making. Thinking about when we collect some students' information, right? Their test score or something related to their performance, and then we use those kind of information to design whether the student passed the course or not, right? So assessment could be formative, right? Promoting learning, or summative, thinking about recording and reporting student achievement, or it can be formal, right? Carefully planned and administered, or informal, which is spontaneously conducted as a part of instruction. Thinking about you ask some question during your teaching, right? Or assessment can be high stakes, right? For example, when we use assessment results to make important decisions, um, university admissions, for example, or assessment can be low stakes, right? Think about when assessment results have minor consequences for stakeholders. So let me give you some example. In mainstream primary school or secondary schools, classroom teachers tend to be responsible for low stakes assessment, right? Including, informal assessment, asking some question in the class, or short oral and written quizzes. But, the more high stake assessment is managed by either schools or national institutions. So just want to make sure that, you understand the term clearly. So now it is assessment, right? We can see that assessment can be an ongoing process from the very beginning of the course towards the end of the course. But when we talk about the tests, right, from this question, the test is a method that we usually use to collect data, to measure student performance, right? So we'll talk about that. So I'll leave the question for you now. So thinking, I'm gonna let you think about the response letter then. So you will see, what is exactly by a test. Okay, so before we, start figuring out this question, let me talk about a little bit about, the policy, which is, related to the theme of our conference, right? When we talk about the society, we have to think about the policy, right? But when it comes to the policy, there usually is a policy practice gap in language assessment, right? Sometimes policy is not fully implemented due to several reasons. But the first thing that we are going to talk about is the policy intent, right? When we think about the policy intent, we might refer to standardized guidelines for language assessment, right? Usually, language assessment policy are often designed with the intent to create uniform standards that promote fairness, reliability, and validity across educational contexts. So these kind of guidelines typically emphasize, standardized testing formats, specific language skills, and performance benchmarks intended to support consistent evaluation across different institutions and levels. But unfortunately, we have to be aware of practical reality, right? Thinking about some challenges in classroom implementation. Usually when we think about the policy, well, the policy is clear already, right? It is crystal clear. But despite clear policy intentions, implementing standardized assessment guidelines in diverse classroom settings can be challenging, right? I'm pretty sure that, here we have a lot of educators here. And when we implement the policy in our classroom, it can be challenging, right? And language teachers often encounter practical limitations. For example, different levels of student language proficiency, mixed ability classroom, right? Limited time, especially in our country, in Thailand, we have a lot of holidays, right? Which affect, teaching schedule. So limited time, resource constraints, as Richard mentioned at the very beginning, we are moving towards the world of AI, right? But what about those schools in marginalized area, right? They would have resource constraints, right? And the pressure to focus on curriculum completion, maybe from the school principal or director, right? So these kind of factors make the policy difficult to fully align. Make the classroom assessment practice difficult to fully align with the policy expectations, right? And then this could result in adaptations that may stray away from standardized guidelines. So we have policy intent, we have some sad practical reality, and what about the consequences, right? When we think about the consequences, there could be what we call misalignment between goals and outcomes, right? The goals established in the policy and the outcomes measured in an actual practice. So the gap between policy intent and classroom reality can lead to significant misalignments. So language teachers may prioritize classroom assessment that do not fully reflect policy standards, right? Affecting the reliability of student assessment and evaluation. So this misalignment can impact students' learning experience and outcomes, as assessment may fail to accurately measure intended competencies. So finally, or ultimately, this could weaken the link between policy objectives and practical educational outcomes. So we now see some problem that occur in our society, right? We have language policy, we have language assessment policy here, which is which has clear policy intents, and this is actually classroom reality or practical reality. It mismatches, right? It doesn't go together. So how can we do that, right? So what we need to do is we might need to connect policy to practice, right? Which is, related to our conference theme. So when we want to connect, policy to practice, first of all, we need to analyze our policy first. So just want to make sure that we understand the policy well, right? we have to be able to interpret assessment guidelines, which is in the policy for practical application, right? Make sure that we understand the policy in your own country. And then we have to think of contextual adaptation, right? So the policies should be tailored to specific classroom environments. So once we understand the policy, we can think of some contextual factors, some classroom factors, some teaching factors, and then adapt it or tailor that to suit your particular context, right? And then think about integration. So we need to seamlessly incorporate policies into teaching practices. So now I have been talking a lot about how to bridge the gap between policy and practices, but well, what is your policy in your? So in the next slide, I'm going to give you some, I'm going to call it an evaluation, right? Evaluation of approaches in language assessment. So you can see, some evolvement of each approach. So let's get back, to 1990s or before. I wasn't born yet. Maybe I was living in my past life back then. Think about, originally we have traditional testing approaches. Well, the name already suggests, what it is like, right? Traditional testing approaches. Well, back then we focused on grammar translation. We've been talking about grammar translation for quite a long time, right? And discrete point testing. So back then, there was an emphasis on measuring isolated language competence, right? Thinking about, we test vocabulary, we test grammar through paper-based tests in isolation. I'm pretty sure, many people can relate this kind of situation because in some countries, even in Thailand, we still have this kind of isolated testing, right? And there was a limited focus on communicative or practical language use, just grammar, just vocabulary, and that's it. And then there are some shifts, into structuralism and psychometric approaches. So this was driven by structural linguistics and behavioralist psychology, right? So standardized testing began. Okay, this was the time when we might have heard the term standardized testing. So this emphasized reliability and validity, right? Standardized, right? By using item analysis. So during this period, language is seen as a collection of separate skills, right? So tests often assess reading, writing, speaking, or listening in isolation, right? So originally we test vocabulary and grammar, very minor point, very micro points, right? In isolation. But now skills, right? Reading, writing, speaking, and listening, but still in isolation. So the emergence of CLT, we have heard communicative language teaching, right? So there are here communicative language testing. So there was a shift towards testing language in context in order to reflect real life communication, right? So we focused on functional language use, authenticity, asking directions, ordering foods, right? Thinking about when we use language, in different functions. And we have to care authenticity as well, and integrated skills assessment. So we developed a test in order to measure learners' ability to use language for specific purposes, right? So after that, we have performance-based assessment or alternative assessment. So there was a rise of assessment that focused on learners' ability to perform tasks, right? So learners should be able to perform some tasks related to, by using English, by using a language, right? So there was a greater focus on student-centered assessment, formative assessment, and feedback. Usually when we talk about formative assessment, so feedback usually comes together with, formative assessment. And there was an attention to assessing language development processes rather than only final products, right? We care final products, but we also focus on process or progress, right? And then after that, we are living in the new era, digital digital era. So we have computer-assisted language testing. We adopt computer in language assessment. So there was an incorporation of technology in assessment, right? For adaptive testing, immediate scoring, or enhanced interactivity. So if you might have heard, or somebody here might have taken TOEFL IBT, right? Internet based. So you usually take a test on a computer, right? And there will be listening and speaking test, right? But it might not be like an actual, or face-to-face interaction, which is semi-direct testing. We speak with a computer, right? We use computer to facilitate, the authenticity of assessment. And then nowadays we have what we call dynamic assessment and sociocultural approaches. I have seen a lot of people, especially in Asian countries, doing research related to dynamic assessment, right? So there is an emphasis on assessment as a developmental process, right? We focus on developmental process, and we also adopt what we call sociocultural theory, Vygotsky, right? Which is, which involves the role of interactions and mediation in assessment. So we believe that, learners may be able to learn from peers, or in social context, right? And assessment are designed to not only measure proficiency, but also support learning and development. And now, what next, right? What is next? So now we are living in the world of AI and digital assessment innovations, right? From now on, you will hear a lot of, the term which is a buzzword now, AI. Everything is related to AI. AI in assessment, AI in teaching, AI in learning, right? So the use of AI for personalized or adaptive testing or automated feedback, right? We can even, have some automated feedback by using an AI, right? So in the future, I think the role of AI would be very essential, right? Very essential. Now it's already essential, but in the future that would be even more essential, and we have to live with an AI, right? So in my opinion, I think we wouldn't be able to deny AI in our teaching or assessment, right? But we have to live with it wisely, right? And in many countries, I can see some potential for virtual reality, right? Especially in the country like Taiwan or Hong Kong, the VR or virtual reality is very famous there, or immersive technologies to create highly authentic assessment context, right? See, we can see some advantages, some benefits of AI or digital assessment innovations in, promoting authenticity in assessment. So now we can see some evolution, right? From a very beginning of traditional testing approaches, and now very flexible, very authentic by the use of AI, right? But let me ask you here. So what is your language assessment policy in your country? Do you still focus on, standardized testing, or you are moving towards formative assessment using an AI? So feel free to drop, a message in a chat box so we can see what, your country looks like, right? In terms of language assessment policy. Do you focus on isolated skills, or do you want to have integrated skills with formative assessment or performance-based assessment? So feel free to share what is it like, in your country in the chat box, so we can relate, what is happening there, right? So leave your message in the chat box, and then I'll come back to see whether are we still on the same page or not, or we have different kind of policy, or we have different kind of focus in terms of policy, right? Again, now we want to improve our students, ability to use a language in their daily life, right? Thinking about functional language use. But nowadays we have what we call global standards. I'm pretty sure that everyone here has heard something related to global standards, right? One of the most famous standards would be CFR, right? So CFR is very common in Thailand as well, right? So an adoption of global standards and high-stake testing, we tend to use international language benchmarks and tests to set uniform proficiency levels, right? Which enables global, comparability and access. So these high-stake exams impact academic and career path, but also raise some issues of fairness and teaching focused on test preparation. Um, Usually in many countries, Thailand included, when when they want to improve, the overall English language proficiency of their students, they play with language assessment policies, right? I'm pretty sure that in other countries, nearby in Asian countries, or I'm not sure, whether in European countries you have this kind of thing as well. Let me give you some example. In Thailand, the Office of Higher Education Commission um, disseminated a policy, right, which aimed at increasing university students' English language proficiency level in higher education institutions. Right? We want to increase their proficiency. So they established, some guidelines or some requirements. And one of the critical requirements put forth in this policy is that higher education institutes should assess, their students' English language proficiency before they graduate, or what we call English exam, right? In Thailand, we kind of implementing an English exam. It might not be fully implemented yet, but now, many universities are gearing towards adopting, the English exam policy. So they assess students, language proficiency before they graduate. For example, university students, they should reach at least like B2, for example. So once they graduate, they need to have, a proof of language proficiency of B2 on CFR in order to graduate. Right? But it's not strictly implemented now, as I mentioned, right? And another thing that they ask higher education institutions to do, they just want to have student tests go online with the CFR or other standards, right? It can be any tests that are aligned, with the CFR, right? To ensure that, they pass a B2, for example. And this was the first time that the CFR appeared officially in a Thai higher education policy. So I'm pretty sure that in many countries, for example, Hong Kong or Taiwan, um, exit examinations are used in those kind of countries already. But there are some pros and cons as well, right? The pros would be, the student learn more in order to prove their proficiency, but the cons would be we might have what we call negative watchback, right? Teaching to the test. So every university or every program, they just want that student to pass the test. So they tend to have like a workshop or a seminar to teach the test and make sure that their students pass the test. This could be a sad story, right? Because they just want to score higher on the test, but they might not care about their actual performance, right? And some practical, implementation challenges that could be related to the policy, as I mentioned earlier, the policy gap, policy practice gap, right? Resource constraints and contextual factors, as I mentioned earlier. So let me touch upon a little bit about the CFR level, right? This is very famous, and I'm pretty sure that many Asian countries also adopt the CFR policy, right? CFR policy is basically the the frameworks, right? The frameworks consist of proficiency levels in different scale, right? From A1, A2, B1, B2, and C1, C2, where the C is the highest. This is a very funny story. Some people have a misconception. They believe that the A level is like the highest, like the A grade, right? And then hey, we are Thai people. We need to improve our language proficiency by getting an A1, right? Because I believe that A1 is like A is a higher, the highest score, like the A grade of the exam, but unfortunately not, right? C is the highest. And the CFR level is actually competence based, which focuses on what learners can do. This is like the highlighted part, right? CFR framework is actually like a can-do statement, right? And it can be adopted globally, regardless of any languages. Okay, so what about national language education standards? I'm pretty sure that in many countries, they might not adapt or adopt CFR frameworks in that particular country, right? But they develop their own standards, right? This can be good to particular countries, right? Think about if we are, for example, in my country, Thailand, if we develop our own standards, this could be good because it is country specific, right? It is related to our country. It is relevant, right? The relevance is one of the most important factors when we have to think about the standards, right? We have to make sure that, the standard meets the needs of language learners, right? And it could be something related to adaptability. We just want to make sure that the standards are tailored to local educational contexts, right? Okay, now we see some, some kind of policies, some challenges in implementation, and some gap, right? So what is next? What should we do then? Right? What should we do? We have to think about, something about the purpose of assessment. Now we have different kind of assessment, right? Assessment for learning, assessment as learning, assessment of learning. I'm not gonna go in detail here because I'm pretty sure that you might have heard this kind of term before. AFL, right? AAL or AOL, right? So another thing that we have to keep in mind, which is testing, measurement, assessment, and evaluation. If you take a look at this diagram, we can see that testing is a very small part, right? Tests are a subset of assessment, and certainly not the only form of assessment that a teacher can make or use to assess students. So let's get back to the question that I asked you earlier. Can we live without tests? The answer can be yes or no, right? It depends on your objective, or it depends on your course, objectives or outcomes, right? But just want to give you some message here, some key message here that assessing is not always testing, right? When we assess our students' ability, we don't have to use testing, right? Because assessing is not always testing, but testing is one way of assessing. So let's get back to the previous slide. We can see that testing is a subset of assessment, and assessing is not always testing, and testing is one way of assessing. So can we live without a test? If your answer is yes, that could be true, right? Because we can use another type of assessment. We can use altitude assessment, we can use formative assessment. But if you say, well, we cannot live without a test, it means that we are required to use a test, right, in your evaluation. So again, it depends on your course objective, it depends on your policy, it depends on your school principal, or it depends on your school director. So if they require us to use a test, so we cannot live without a test. And then now we have a shift towards assessment for learning and learning oriented assessment, right? We focus more on continuous feedback, right? Feedback is very important in assessment. So make sure that whenever we give students some assessment tasks, make sure that we give them some feedback, right? Feedback can inform instruction for us as a teacher and also support learning. Student knows what to do next, right? They know what they are at, which stage they are at, and what they should, progress next, right? And we have to think about student reflection, right? This is assessment as learning, right? The students have some roles in assessing their ability. So we can develop self-assessment for them to use, or we can ask them to reflect their learning. And we have to think about authentic tasks in order to measure real-world language proficiency. So we need to move away from, discrete point testing or isolated testing, but we have to engage in authentic tasks, performance-based tasks, and give them some feedback and have, if time permits, student reflection. And also, we have to think about inclusive and culturally responsive assessment, right? So in this slide, I will talk about the concept of creating assessment that honor diversity and promote inclusivity in the classroom. So now we are living in the world of inclusivity and diversity, right? And this slide highlights the importance of what we call multilingual accommodation, right? Recognizing that students come from varied backgrounds, maybe linguistic backgrounds, right? Or their ethnic backgrounds, and they may need support to fully demonstrate their abilities. So this is multilingual accommodations. When we design the test or assessment task, make sure that we keep this in mind, right? The next one is culturally relevant content. Okay, so the role of culturally relevant content in making assessment meaningful. When assessment reflects students' own experiences, they not only validate students' identities, but also engage them on a deeper level, which makes the assessment process more relevant and impactful, right? But if the students do not have access to a particular culture, this could be meaningless, right? Because they don't get a sense that what we're trying to say. And finally, we have to think about universal design or equity, right? So universal design can ensure that assessments are accessible to all learners, regardless of their individual needs. So this approach promotes fairness, right? Which allows every student the opportunity to succeed without unnecessary barriers. Together, these principles or these factors, multilingual accommodation, culturally relevant content, universal design equity, highlight a commitment to inclusivity and responsiveness, which shapes assessments that are fair, supportive, and culturally aware. Okay. So what are some actionable strategies for language educators then? I would like to give you some actionable strategies that we can adopt in our assessment practices. The first one, we might have to think about authentic assessment design, right? We should create real-world language tasks for assessment and evaluation. Thinking about how students can utilize language in their daily life, right? And we have to think about formative assessment, try to implement ongoing feedback mechanism, right, along the way. Don't just test them during the midterm and during the final examinations, right? But we have to assess them along the way because assessment is an ongoing process, right? And we might have to consider integrating technology. Right? We might utilize digital tools for efficient assessment, time saving, right? Time efficient, convenient, for example. But this might not be necessarily because in some areas or in some regions or in some places, technology can be a constraint, right? And another thing that we have to think about, which is student-centered assessment, we might consider adopting self-assessment, which encourages students to evaluate their progress. We might consider adopting peer evaluation or peer assessment, which could facilitate constructive peer feedback sessions. They learn from one another, right? And then we can make some choices in assessment. We might have to offer some multiple ways to demonstrate language proficiency. Don't stick to just one particular choice, right? If you, I'm a big fan of multiple choice question, and then you use multiple choice question all the way to course, that would be a little bit of problematic, right? Because, multiple choice question format has its own disadvantages and shortcomings. Well, I would say every kind of assessment has pros and cons, right? Digital, okay, digital analog assessment. When we think about digital options, you can also do this, and you can also adopt, analog alternative as well, depending on your readiness, right? In your classroom, sometimes the internet might not be working, right? We need to use some analog alternative by using hands-on activity or portfolio or self-reflection, right? So we have to think about resource constraints. Another thing, okay, we are running out of time. Another thing that we have to keep in mind, which is the 5 principles of for testing and assessment tasks. When we design any assessment task, make sure that we keep in mind of reliability, validity, practicality, authenticity, and watchback. It might not be practical to have very high reliability, very high validity, and very high practicality, high authenticity at the same time, right? But make sure that we are aware of this when we design any task, right? And also we have to think about the test usefulness as well, right? For the test usefulness, we have some addition, which is interactiveness, right? So make sure that our students have some interaction with the language when they're doing an assessment task, right? Let me give you some scenarios here. The first scenario is that some typists do not understand English very well, but they have developed a high level of ability to perform certain typing tasks in English. So they find it difficult to produce English on their own, but they are excellent typists and produce high quality typescripts, even from handwritten documents, which is the only task required for their job. So if we want to design a screening test, we just simply ask them to type from a handwritten document. That is, a typist might be able to simply to copy the letters and words without processing the document as a piece of discourse, right? So we can see this. In this scenario, authenticity is very high. It is related to their real life practice, right? But unfortunately, interactiveness is very low because the test takers do not have any interaction with the language. They just look at the text or the words and then simply copy it, right? But if we take a look at another scenario here, we use a role play in which a prospective salesperson are required to attempt to sell a product. Face-to-face oral conversation with an interlocutor who plays the role of the potential customer. So the test taker might be required to engage the customer in a conversation, decide upon what kind of approach to use in selling tasks, and carry out the task. So the authenticity is high, right? It is related to their job duties, and the interactiveness is also high because then they need to decide which strategy or which approach they will use in the selling task. So you can see the differences, right, between these two scenarios. Sometimes high authenticity might not mean high interactiveness. But at the end of the day, at least, we need to have our students to interact with the language. So we can use our assessment tasks to kind of allow them to interact with the language, right? So, and we have to keep in mind that certain test tasks may be relatively useful for their intended purposes, even though they are low in either authenticity and interactiveness. As I mentioned earlier, it might be impractical to be like very high in all aspects, right? And something that we have to keep in mind when we design, assessment tasks, something in the classroom context what we call classroom-based language assessment, right? We need to require our students to perform the tasks, okay? And we need them to perform in an authentic situations, okay? For example, think about language function that student might be able to use in their life, ordering food, asking for directions, buying clothes, for example. So the student should show what they can do rather than what they know, right? So they can do is performance, what they know is competence, right? Sometimes competence is something in their brain, but performance is something that they perform, right? So we want them to be able to perform in their real life. So students should be able to demonstrate knowledge and skills through their performance tasks, right? So at the end of the day, what we need to keep in mind is that when we have rubrics, usually when we design performance-based assessment or authentic assessment, we need to have a clear rubric score, right? We have to have a clear scoring rubric. So we know what to measure and students know what they are being measured. So scoring rubric should be provided to the students before the assessment so they can prepare, for assessment tasks, right? And they should be able to understand the rubric, right? They should understand the rubric before the task, right? So we have to give them some clear explanation of what it means by this criterion or whatever, right? And after the task, we need to give them feedback, maybe based on their performance or based on the rubric, right? Before the task, scoring rubric. After the task, feedback. If we have both things, before and after, this could lead to learning improvement, right? Let me give you some example of assessment tasks. For example, I have some learning objective, which is students should be able to narrate their holidays using past tenses correctly. So my assessment task, in a way that to measure their performance, we might not be able to measure them through, written tests, right? Sometimes written tests cannot guarantee that they are able to speak in English. So I asked them to create a holiday narration vlog. Right? Kids these days they are digital natives. All right, they are on TikTok, they are on YouTube, on different kinds of platform. And if we ask them to do this kind of vlog, they would be happy to. At least my students, right? So this is the task description. Students will create a vlog narrating a past holiday experience, and the vlog should include details about their trip, activities they participated in, and their overall experience. So students should use a variety of past tenses, simple past, past continuous, past perfect, to convey their narration accurately, right? So we can make sure that they know how to use the tenses correctly through their verbal products, right? This is just some example that we can do, okay? But again, this might not be a simple task, right? What we can think about an effective policy implementation, we need professional developments. We need to train language educators on policy application, make sure that they understand the policy clearly and accurately. And we have to think about resource allocation, right? The government should provide necessary tools for implementation. We cannot just leave the teacher behind, right? And we have to think about stakeholder engagement. We might need to involve all parties or stakeholders in implementation process. And again, most importantly, we need to monitor and adjust, right? We need to regularly review and refine implementation strategies. Okay. So I'm gonna skip this. We have been talking a lot about feedback, progress, and whatever, but something that I wanna leave a final words before we wrap up my webinar here. We need to think about some improvement, right? I know the policy is there, and maybe every 5 years or every 10 years, the policies are changed, right? Depending on, you know, um, the trends or whatever. But what we need to have continuous assessment improvement, right? We need to be able to reflect the policy. We need to critically examine current assessment practices, whether it is good or not, whether it is effective or not, right? And we need more research. We have to do research in order to explore some innovative assessment methodologies, right? Sometimes, think about some people would think this particular methodology is very effective, but when we adopt this methodology in our context, it might not be effective, right? This is all about practicality. So that is why we have to do research in order to find some effective or some suitable assessment methodologies. And also after research, we have to revise, right? We have to update assessment strategies based on the findings, okay? And then after that, we have to reinforce, right? We have to implement and support new assessment practices. And this would be in a cycle way, right? We enforce, we reflect, we do research, we revise, we reinforce, back and forth. Just like when we do action research, right? We have pre-plan, we have a act, we have or observe, we have our reflect. And this is like a cycle, right? If we want to improve our language assessment in our country, or if we want to fully or effectively implement the policy, we need some continuous assessment improvement. We need to reflect. We need to do more research. We need to revise it to, to be suitable to the context, right? And then we have to give support to such changes, right? And what we can do, I'm pretty sure that this is not advertising, but I would encourage you, the participants, to attend our conference, which will be held in Bangkok, Thailand. In this conference, you will learn a lot about language assessment practices, what is a trend of language assessment, what are we moving towards, which is the power of language assessment on individuals and society. We are not just improving the quality of one individual students, but our kids or our students are our future, right? They could grow up and better or improve the society. So our conference will be held on the 21st to 23rd of November this month, in a few weeks, at Chulalongkorn University. So if you are around here in Bangkok, or if you are free during those days, join us at Chulalongkorn University. So that would be all. Okay, we are running out of time. We have five minutes left. So thank you so much. If you have any questions, feel free to drop your question, or if you want to talk more about language assessment, feel free to email me. I would love to talk more, and I would love to entertain some questions, if there are any.
Okay, great. Yes, there are. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
Yes, we love to talk about language assessment. So let me go straight in. I think we've got time just for one or maybe two questions. So Jamie Clayton asked, his question is here. It says, any thoughts on how we can balance adapting the CEFR to our local context, while at the same time ensuring that the B2 equivalent certificate students are awarded really means B2 equivalence in other contexts? That's quite a big question, but
it is.
If you've got a minute or two to try and answer that, that would be good.
Okay, this is a very interesting question. Even in our country, we are trying to do this. We are trying to balance, the weights between another extreme part to another side, which is related to our classroom context, right? But one thing that we can do is that we have to look closely to the descriptors in that particular level, right? And then, once we understand the descriptors that, this is what our students should be able to do, okay? And then we can design our task, assessment task, based on that particular can-do statement, right? But I think, in my opinion, it would take time. And if you are very strict about the descriptors, and we want to kind of implement every descriptor. That would be impossible in limited time, right? Usually thinking about if we have to teach our students just only 1 or 2 semesters, that would be impossible. But at least, we do something related to the descriptor, which is the teachers develop assessment tasks based on the same descriptors. I think that is the most that we can do.
Okay, thank you. We have another question, which is the difference between assessment of learning, for learning, and as learning.
Okay, so basically,
this is from Beatrix. Yeah.
Okay, assessment of learning, right? We assess the learning. So think about summative assessment, right? When we think about assessment of learning, we make judgment whether our student pass or fail, or we just want to make some decision based on the learning progress or the student's learning progress, right? But when we talk about assessment for learning, we assess for students to learn, right? We track progress, we monitor their progress, we give them some feedback so they know what they should improve in order to improve their learning progress. So this is assessment for learning. But assessment as learning or assessment while learning, there will be student involvement, right? The student will have some opportunities to kind of self-assess their learning along with teachers' assessment. So they would have some self-assessment or self-reflection. So we can see the major differences between the goal of each one, right? So this is different between the 3 concepts.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I think that's all we have time for now. If you have further questions, please try to, you could email us or email Pariwat, or even better, you could come to the conference and speak to him in person and ask him lots more questions. Would be great. Please, we just got in the chat is a form for you to fill in a survey about this webinar, and if you fill in this survey, you can get a certificate of attendance for this webinar as well. You can see on the screen that I've shared the link to our conference page, and you can register here. Registration is still open, and we would love to see you at the conference. Thank you very much, Pariwat. Again, it was a really fascinating talk. You really covered a lot of ground in your talk, I think, which has been really informative. So thanks once again. Thank you, everyone who has attended today. Thank you for your time, which you have given to us to attend this webinar today. And we hope to see you again soon and at the conference, if you can make it. Thank you. Have a good day, and we'll speak to you again soon. Goodbye.